Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the final lecture in the new winter lecture series that will introduce us all to a new scholar in our midst, and it really is a pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Before I do that, however, just a couple of announcements. Firstly, we do have an online audience, so we'll alternate after the talk with some questions for you all in person, and also our online audience. Today's speaker, Dr. Alma Gottlieb, is a emeritus professor from the University of Illinois Champaign, Urbana, and currently a visiting scholar at Brown University. She was educated, her PhD and MA are from the University of Virginia, and her bachelor's degree from Sarah Lawrence College. And her CV is so extensive that I cannot do it justice, but she is the author or editor of 9 books, including A World of Babies, Imagined Childcare Guides for 8 Societies, Braided Worlds, The Restless Anthropologist, The Afterlife is Where We Came From. I'm just reading you the titles. It would take too long. I'm sorry, but you're not here to hear me. You want to hear our speaker. A World of Babies. Let's see. I said that one. The Beng English Dictionary, Parallel Worlds, and Under the Kapok Tree. Oh, and Blood Magic, The Anthropology of Menstruation. So, goodness, and that's not even to mention the articles and special issues of journals and so forth. So, an extraordinary scholar, and please join me in welcoming Alma Gottlieb, speaking today on Crypto Jews of New Mexico and Cape Verde, Long Lost Cousins, ? Thank you.
Can you hear me? All right. If I start whispering, just wave. Thanks so much, Paul, for having invited me, and to Mary Madigan and Matt Garcia for all the behind-the-scenes work to make my talk possible. Anyone else helping organize today's talk in important ways that have remained invisible to me? There's always a lot of invisible labor in these events. And to all of you in the room and online, wherever you may be out there, for spending this part of your day with me and us. I appreciate it. So since 2018, my writer husband and I have split our time between New Mexico, where our son's family lives down the road, and Rhode Island, which is a hotbed of the Cape Verdean diaspora. So as a part-time resident of Santa Fe, I am especially excited to share a corner of my ongoing research that actually speaks to both of my homes. I know you know where New Mexico is, but Cape Verde, maybe not so much. In New England, when some people hear about Cape Verde, they assume it must be another name for Cape Cod. But no, it's an island nation. What am I doing? Off the coast of West Africa. I began doing research with Cape Verdeans who have Jewish ancestry back in 2006. At the time, I'd read a little bit about intriguingly named crypto Jews who'd lived in the Southwest for many centuries, some of whom had only vague or even increasingly across generations no knowledge of their Jewish ancestry. I'm guessing that many of you are well acquainted with that history of the now well-known but for a long time crypto or hidden Jews of New Mexico, as well as Arizona and Texas. Perhaps some of you might have forebears dating to that era. As for me, the more I learned about Cape Verdeans, the more I was reminded of what I knew about New Mexico's crypto Jews, because the two groups seem to share some historical parallels. And as I researched, I discovered that New Mexico, Rhode Island, and Cape Verde, so distant in miles, might actually be linked by surprising historical ties. It's true that those islands in the North Atlantic, some 350 miles off the shore of West Africa's Senegal, are over 5,000 miles away from where we are now in landlocked New Mexico. But I hope you'll be patient, and Follow me on the story I'd like to tell you, a story that by the time I'm done might surprise you too by how familiar it sounds. So here in New Mexico, the historical connection to Spain is strong and well known. When we read about the Iberian Peninsula, Spain's much larger share of real estate easily claims all the attention, leaving tiny Portugal in the shadows. But starting in the late 15th century, the fate of Iberia's Jews of both nations became intimately linked. In the preceding century, anti-Semitism in Spain had reached such proportions that a very large number of Spanish Jews had already been forced to convert to Catholicism. So when Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued their infamous Edict of Expulsion, known as the Alhambra Decree, in 1492, requiring all remaining Jews who hadn't yet converted to Christianity to either convert or flee in exile, many of those Jews, perhaps some 30,000 of them, took what seemed to be the easiest escape route, crossing the border into neighboring Portugal, where Judaism hadn't yet been outlawed. The leaders in Portugal's Jewish communities were unhappy about this development. They perceived increasing Christian sentiment against them in their own nation and were endeavoring to keep a low profile. Although they felt empathy for their Spanish co-religionists, suddenly swelling their ranks by large numbers seemed a risky proposition, likely to make them more visible, hence more vulnerable. And perhaps they were right. The competing Iberian monarchs from Spain and Portugal craved dominance over the peninsula, and each connived to forge a political matrimony that could work to their political advantage. In 1496, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella agreed for their oldest daughter to marry the young Portuguese monarch, King Manuel, as long as Portugal issued its own edict of expulsion of the nation's Jews, as well as Muslims. Reluctantly, ambitious Manuel agreed. But at the last moment, he panicked about the social, economic, and political implications of expelling a relatively well-educated group that counted a disproportionate number of doctors, lawyers, financiers, intellectuals, artisans, and especially engineers and astronomers among their ranks, the latter two professions supplying key personnel in crafting new navigational technologies and charting new maritime routes to new lands that were becoming the source of the Portuguese crown's wealth. And so Manuel concocted what he must have considered a clever trick, instructing all Jews to bring their belongings to a port in Lisbon where boats would comfortably transport them to foreign destinations. He instead arranged for them to be greeted not by ships, but by priests. Those who didn't commit suicide in despair were immediately and forcibly converted to Christianity and deprived of the option to leave. With this deception, Manuel not only outraged the Jews he betrayed, he also infuriated his increasingly anti-Semitic countrymen and women, since he had now required all Jews to remain in the country rather than sending them into exile. At the same time, he tricked his wife and in-laws. Yes, he no longer had any Jews by that name in his country, but neither had he expelled them, as he'd promised. Instead, he renamed them. Henceforth, they would no longer be called Jews. Rather, they would be known as New Christians. If we wanted to be mischievous, perhaps we might say Manuel's strategy was a veritable Talmudic kind of solution. These seeming sleights of hand were not merely rhetorical. A decade after the Portuguese Edict of Expulsion, a 3-day anti-Semitic riot erupted in Lisbon, where as many as 4,000 Jews were individually murdered by their neighbors in the streets. Appalled, King Manuel reversed his essential imprisonment of Jews and opened the Portuguese borders, allowing them to flee his unwelcoming nation. Thus began what turned into a global diaspora, ebbing and flowing in keeping with the dramas of regional politics. By 1536, after Manuel had been succeeded by his son João III, anti-Semitism had become so normalized in Portugal that the Pope authorized the establishment of Inquisition courts to try any self-described Christian suspected of engaging in non-Christian religious practices. This included former Jews, Muslims, Lutherans, Freemasons, bigamists, homosexuals, critics of the Catholic Church, and so-called witches. But in practice, especially in the early years, the overwhelming number of people indicted and tried were Jews. Prisoners might be punished with all manner of torture, up to and including the notorious spectacle of being mockingly paraded before thousands in an unironically named auto da fe, or act of faith, through the city's main streets, followed by death by public burning. The reasons for these cruel and far-reaching edicts and their extreme means of enforcement are multiple and still debated among historians. What is certain is the cataclysmic effect they had on Iberia's Jewish communities. No doubt, some former Jews converted with sincerity. We know that some eventually rose to high positions in the church, up to and including the role of bishop and even, almost unbelievably, grand inquisitor. The Portuguese and Spanish Inquisitions trained these new Christians to conceal their prior identity as thoroughly as possible, lest they be accused of the potentially capital crime of returning to Judaism, or as it was called, Judaizing. Yet some converts, so-called, led double lives. Baptizing their children and attending church every Sunday, they nevertheless held Jewish services on Friday nights in darkened rooms or basements. These were the Portuguese equivalents of New Mexico's crypto-Jews. Practicing their religion in secrecy, some enjoyed generous protection from sympathetic Christian neighbors. Some were called anusim, meaning coerced, or conversos, meaning converted, or marranos, which some alleged meant pig, derived indirectly from Arabic. Some suffered denunciation by neighbors or business rivals, or even disaffected or coerced relatives to the Inquisition's local representatives, with dire, often tragic consequences. As historian Miriam Bodian writes of the self-described Portuguese Holy Office that ran the Inquisition, quote, with its anonymous denunciations and secret trials, no new Christians could feel secure. As the Iberian Inquisition rounded up more prisoners, many lost hope for survival in their homeland if they wished to continue practicing their religion. Remaining in Iberia only gave them two choices: convert fully to Catholicism or lead a spiritually double, therefore endangered life. So, unsurprisingly, over the next couple of centuries, some tens of thousands of Jews opted to resist those two choices. Large numbers of Spanish Jews crossed the border into Portugal and joined their Portugal-born co-religionists. Taking different risks from what threatened them if they stayed, they fled the land they had once called home for destinations not only across Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia, but also to much of coastal Asia and the Americas. In this way, they created what's now known as the Sephardic Diaspora, whose roots lie in the Iberian Peninsula, that landmass known in Hebrew as Sepharad. Some of those men accompanied Cortes in his military expedition conquering the Aztec Empire in 1519 to 21. Two decades later, Sephardic Jewish men accompanied Coronado to this region in 1540. Down the road in Bernalillo, the Coronado Historic Site, which I urge all of you to visit if you've never been, has displays that includes many Portuguese names among the 500 soldiers listed as accompanying Coronado. Some of these were likely conversos or crypto-Jews. Later, during the 60-year period known euphemistically as the Iberian Union from 1580 to 1640, Spain ruled Portugal, so a good number of men sailing to the Americas as Spaniards were actually Portuguese. I mention these as examples of the intertwined relations among Portuguese and Spanish Jews during the height of the two neighboring Inquisitions. However, escapees from the peninsula did not always find freedom. When Jews or new Christians arrived in lands controlled by the expanding Spanish or Portuguese empires, persecution followed them. In the Americas, we know this well for Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, where the Spanish Inquisition established local courts. Portugal did the same in Goa, which became part of Portuguese India. Moreover, the lucky ones who escaped the perilous peninsula certainly brought the memory of persecution with them. However their choices differed, all these groups must have retained memories of their earlier lives as Jews, at first consciously, in later generations, perhaps at less than conscious levels. The dramatic events preceding their lives had a deep impact on the sense of identity that ipso facto reshaped the sense of self in these Jews who were no longer Jews. In effect, from the combination of the earlier edicts of expulsion and the Inquisition courts in Portugal and Spain, a new kind of person was created. As Esther Benbassa and Jean-Christophe Attias have written in their book, The Jew and the Other, beneath these diverse scenarios, the epic of the Marranos is such that they and their descendants became vagabonds of identity, masters of hesitation, inventors of spaces of a third kind. That complicated sense of self is now well understood for the descendants of Spain's crypto-Jews who ended up in the Americas, including here in New Mexico. Far less known is the effect in Africa. For if the broad outlines of this remarkable dispersion are now familiar to those familiar with Sephardic history, perhaps one of the least known destinations of those Iberian refugees is Cape Verde, or Cabo Verde, as it's known in Portugal. The 10 islands had only been discovered by European mariners in the 1450s and 60s. For refugees fleeing religious oppression, the archipelago must have held out promise for a new life in a new land, especially because at the time of European discovery, the archipelago was actually devoid of people. We now know that the early generations of European, mostly Portuguese, colonizers of the Cape Verde Islands included a disproportionately large number of Jews. Historian Tobias Green writes, quote, "By the 17th century, the Cristãos Novos, or New Christians, were the predominant European social group in Cabo Verde." From the earliest period, Portuguese slave traders, some Jewish, some Catholic, also brought increasing numbers of kidnapped West Africans to the islands. Some were sent across the brutal Middle Passage for sale in the Americas, but others remained as enslaved laborers on the islands. On the archipelago, mixed race and interfaith unions linked both Jewish and Catholic men with West African women. No doubt some of these unions were forced, especially if they involved male slave owners. Other unions were likely consensual, especially for men who were trading in items such as dyes, animal hides, crops, and so on, but not humans. Whatever the intimate nature of their relationships, which we'll probably never know, these unions produced generations of mixed-race children. Among the earliest Iberian refugees, some were still practicing Judaism, some had already converted to Christianity, some would have left Portugal or Spain as new Christians but hoping to resume openly practicing the religion of their ancestors, and some may have become more secular, disillusioned perhaps by the God of their ancestors that appeared to have forsaken them. They would have neglected both Jewish and Christian options. Yet, members of all of these groups would have been equally subject to the stigmatizing label of Cristão Novo, or New Christian, as two historians put it, eternal prisoners of their genealogy. For any Jews who hoped to find a space of religious tolerance, that hope proved futile. The legal machinery of the Portuguese courts cast a long shadow. While Portugal didn't establish actual Inquisition courts in Cape Verde, the island drew spies sent from Lisbon. Some islanders were arrested and sent back to Lisbon to be tried for heresy. In effect, passing as Catholic could only be partial, given the enforced label of New Christian that publicly marked their difference from Old Christians. As long as the Inquisition remained a viable institution, those labels rendered former Jews perpetually vulnerable to denunciation, deportation, trial, torture, and capital punishment. Thus, those New Christian residents lucky enough to escape being denounced while in Cape Verde would likely have felt motivated at least to conceal, if not entirely renounce, most, if not all, Jewish practices. What had lured them to chase the dream of a remote space of spiritual safety would have quickly revealed itself as yet another space of danger. And so within a few generations, their descendants became fully incorporated into the dominant Catholic ethos of the islands. Today, many Cape Verdeans who have roots in that early era likely have Jewish ancestors, but may not realize it. How might such lack of awareness have been perpetuated? As one such person told me, there are certain things that could have been a signal, but they weren't talked about. It just stayed taboo. Generations of Jewish parents must have felt compelled to raise generations of children with decreasing knowledge of their religious heritage. Passing as a Christian turned into living the life of a Christian. Within several generations, we might say, the deception became internalized. Given these conditions, we may understand why few living descendants of those early refugees identify today with their Jewish ancestors. Even so, today, others are now finding themselves incredulous and/or delighted to discover potential signs of this early stage in their families' lives. As the writer Philip Graham once wrote, quote, "Memory, imperfect, fluid, sometimes hazy, waits for us to return and re-return, to examine and re-examine what at first we cannot see. We are collectors not of memories so much as those memories' shadows, so that we might recover through their nurturing darkness the hidden meaning of our lives." In considering the family histories and contemporary lives of Cape Verdeans today, I can't help but think of the long shadow cast by a similar and historically related process haunting Spanish Jews across their long-ago journeys from Iberia to the Americas. Today in New Mexico, the contemporary rediscovery in some cases, and in other cases, the decision to finally acknowledge those hidden shadows by crypto-Jews, has uncanny parallels with the process that many Cape Verdeans today are now undergoing. As with New Mexico's crypto-Jews, many Cape Verdeans today are recuperating the Jewish components of their frequently secret identity. Since 2006, I've been researching this dispersed yet increasingly connected group as they actively seek both information and one another to explore and in different ways incorporate some Jewish components of their identity. My research in the US, Europe, and Africa has focused on a range of individuals, including those who know that they have Jewish ancestry. Most of those have more recent Jewish ancestry dating to a second wave of Jews arriving in Cape Verde in the 19th century from Morocco. I'm not talking about those today. Those who suspect that they might have Jewish forebears, and those who have no known Jewish ancestry but find themselves intrigued by the fact that other Cape Verdeans have such family histories. Well, here's a question I've asked many Cape Verdeans. Do you eat pork? And here's a variety of the answers that I've received. No, it doesn't taste good to me. I try to stay away from pork. I'm not a big pork person. No, it gives me a stomach ache. I tried abstaining from pork for 1.5 years, but then found the call of bacon a bit too tempting. But that's the only pork I eat. The real Cape Verdean cachupa stew doesn't contain pork. The Portuguese introduced pork into cachupa. The best cachupa I ever had was always with fish. This is a owner of a Cape Verdean restaurant in Paris who I was interviewing. That's how my grandmother made it, with fresh tuna caught from the sea and cut up in little pieces. That's how I make it here in his restaurant. In these statements, each response to the question, do you eat pork, evoked a rationale that implies an individual decision. Yet collectively, they might suggest to us a different biography. This particular daily habitus, shaped by abandoned religious traditions, isn't unique. In my research, I've observed many quotidian and ritual activities that strikingly resemble Jewish practices, while not always acknowledged as such by those who practice them. These include rituals at both ends of the life cycle. For example, some Cape Verdeans have described to me their family's custom of putting an anklet or waistband sporting a 6-pointed Star of David around the foot or waist of a newborn without knowing the Jewish association of this star shape. The other end of the life cycle also reveals Jewish practices in many Cape Verdean households, again, often unrecognized. For example, the No Jadu funeral ritual custom, common in Cape Verde, bears many similarities to the common Jewish funeral custom of sitting Shiva. Davida, who was born in Cape Verde but now lives in Rotterdam, recalled her family's mourning customs from her childhood. She said, when someone died for 7 days, people came to your house, and after 1 year, they all came together again. Until recently, Davida was unaware that her family's funeral schedule echoed the classic Jewish mourning calendar. Yet somehow, for reasons she couldn't explain as a child, she said she resisted practicing Catholic ritual. She told me, I didn't want to do communion. It didn't feel right for me as a child. Only recently did Davida confirm the Jewish identity of her ancestors when her mother told her that, quote, her father told her as a child that they were from Jewish blood, but that she wasn't allowed to talk about it. Davida, already a mother of two, explained her reaction at the time when her mother finally told this when she was in her 30s. Well, I thought, couldn't you have told me earlier? She kept me waiting a long time. Another Cape Verdean woman had a strikingly similar reaction. In recounting the moment when she verified her Jewish ancestry from her father, Carlota told me, if you remember people lighting candles on Friday nights, that was one of those things where my father was like, oh yeah, I remember that. I thought, you could have told me when I asked you the first time. Jeanne, another Cape Verde-born woman now living in Rhode Island, discovered unexpected affinities between her family's funeral practices and those of practicing Jews. One day, Jeanne described the casket style with which she grew up on the island of Santiago. She said, it's a simple, light wood with no decorations at all. The only thing on the outside is simple handles for carrying the coffin. Although this casket style resembles the common Jewish predilection for using a simple pine box or no casket at all, rather than the highly ornate caskets used by many Cape Verdean Catholic families, Jeanne had never considered the likely origins of her family's funeral practice. Common family surnames suggest another possible route to unrecognized ancestry. Abundant Sephardic oral history suggests that many Inquisition-era Jews living in rural areas who remained in Iberia and converted to Catholicism took on surnames rooted in the natural world, both trees and mammals. Renaming to conceal previous Jewish identity became a potential means to survive. Today, very common such surnames include tree and plant names such as Carvalho, oak tree, Figueira, fig tree, Lima, lime tree, Pereira, pear tree, Pinheiro, pine tree, Oliveira, olive tree, Rosa, rose, and Silva, thicket or woods. And animal names such as Cabral, goat, Coelho, rabbit, leão, lion, lobo, wolf, and pinto, baby chicken. Well, that one's not a mammal, is it? I shouldn't have said mammals. Given this history, Cape Verdeans bearing these surnames may well have ancestors who adopted the name soon after the edicts of expulsion were issued. Yet, given the remoteness of the historical era during which these events would have transpired, few living Cape Verdeans who carry such names recognize Jewish ancestry in their genealogies. Many other long-ago Cape Verdean New Christians adopted classic Old Christian surnames, such as Rodrigues, Nunes, and Mendes, that gave them an even higher likelihood of passing as Christian. An earlier generation of anthropologists might have called these ritual and naming practices retentions or survivals. Yet, if engagements with earlier Jewish practice exists only at the unconscious level, for many Cape Verdeans, others are in the process of developing awareness of those foundations. I'd like to share a conversation during which an individual recognized for the first time the Jewish ancestry of two personal practices. In Rhode Island, Alessia had prepared a traditional afternoon snack of tea and sweet couscous for Teresa, a mutual Cape Verdean friend, and me. As we enjoyed the tasty dish, Alessia explained how she had prepared it. The ingredients included salt. Alessia cast a glance at the characteristic dark blue cardboard box of nearby Morton's kosher salt, which sported a large six-pointed star on its front panel. Alessia said, "That reminds me of the Jewish stars on some of my jewelry. I probably still have some jewelry with a Jewish star on it from when I was a baby. In my family, on the seventh day of a baby's life, we always put a belt around the baby's waist with a few charms on it. One was always a Jewish star." Teresa asked, "But what makes it a Jewish star?" Alessia replied, "It has to be six-pointed. At least on São Vicente, we made a very clear distinction between a five-pointed star and a six-pointed star. We called the six-pointed one Estrela de Judeu, Star of the Jews." Teresa shook her head in amazement. "In my family," she said, We tied a 6-pointed star onto a waistband for a baby too, or it might be a bracelet or an anklet for an older child or even an adult, but I had no idea that it had anything to do with Judaism. Teresa divulged that she too had given what she now knew to be a Jewish star to her own son and daughter as babies. Alessia added that back in Cape Verde, the 6-pointed Jewish star always appeared around Christmas time in her family's home. Either it hung on the wall inside the door, or it dangled from their Christmas tree, or both. Teresa expressed further amazement. Her family had the same practice as well. Indeed, she claimed that many Cape Verdeans all over the archipelago hung a 6-pointed star somewhere in their home during the Christmas season, but she had no idea of the custom's origins. I asked Teresa if she thought that most other Cape Verdeans might know that the 6-pointed star represents Judaism. She asserted, "No, I don't think so. I certainly didn't." Alessia interrupted, "Yes, absolutely, I certainly did know." Alessia appeared proud of her knowledge, which she saw as part of a generally cosmopolitan outlook that she had acquired from growing up on the Cape Verdean island of São Vicente, whose port city of Mindelo attracted people from around the world in the 19th and early 20th centuries. For her part, Teresa left the conversation avowing interest in her family's suddenly complicated religious history. A few years later, both women joined the organizing committee of a volunteer group that hosts a large community Passover Seder linking Cape Verdeans and Jews every year in Boston. Such personal revelations have occurred during many conversations I've had with Cape Verdeans. Each story contains its biographical particularities, but they all share some sense of amazement at the moment of discovery. Once Jewish ancestry emerges as likely or certain, what do Cape Verdeans do with the knowledge? Well, for people such as Teresa, who suddenly learn of a new religious component to their family history, the answer unfolds slowly across future days and months of reflection. For some, a range of behavioral changes may result, from contemplating adopting particular Jewish practices, to trying out some Jewish practices, to adopting some practices, to fully converting and joining synagogues. For those living in New England, which is the center of the Cape Verdean diaspora in the U.S., this process often begins while attending an annual Cape Verdean Jewish Passover Seder that's been held in Boston since 2006. At this Seder, which attracts up to 100 Cape Verdeans and 100 American Jews every year, many Cape Verdeans encounter Jewish ritual and, in some cases, American Jews for the first time. The seating plan intentionally joins members of both groups at each table via being assigned colored dots when entering the room. This table arrangement promotes conversations that often produce curiosity about possible Jewish ancestry on the part of the Cape Verdeans. Another influential event was a ritual rededication of a Moroccan Jewish cemetery held in Praia, the capital city of Cape Verde, in June 2013. With support from the mayor's office, as well as an international organization created for the purpose, the event, which was overseen by the chief rabbi of Lisbon, who arrived for the purpose on the right with a cap, attracted a small but passionate number of Cape Verdeans from around the island and around the world. International publicity spread news of the event. Out of the ritual came a new local organization formed by Cape Verdeans eager to further preserve and publicize Jewish heritage on the islands. Since then, 3 more Moroccan Jewish cemeteries have been restored and ritually rededicated on 2 other of the islands. From encounters with either or both these events or other contexts, some Cape Verdeans are trying out strands of Jewish practice in their life. As they reassess what they thought they knew of their identity, Cape Verdeans sometimes find themselves hard-pressed to categorize themselves. Some seek new labels that acknowledge a hybrid religion, calling themselves Catholic Jews or Jewish Catholics. One Cape Verdean, Ana Lima, has introduced a new term on her blog. She wrote, "On my first trip to Cape Verde, I discovered the cashew fruit. I'd always known the cashew, which is pronounced caju in Portuguese, to be a nut. But it's actually a fruit and a nut. Who knew?" It was during this same trip that I first realized my own Jewish ancestry. All this time I believed my family was Catholic, but as I learned more of my ancestry, I learned that many of our traditions were in fact based in the Jewish faith. I jokingly referred to being a Ka-Jew with a friend of mine who also recently found out about his Jewish roots. Is it possible to be Catholic and Jewish, basically a Ka-Jew? I am a descendant of two groups of very strong people who survived a history of indescribable horrors for merely being who they were. Because of our ancestors, we all have the freedom to be and to live how we'd like to. We are free to worship how we'd like, and I am free to be a Catholic or a Jew, and even a Ka-Jew, if I please. Lima instructed her two children to write cashew under other when asked to name their religion on school forms. So, some concluding thoughts. Lima's story reminds us that what social scientists call border theory has relevance not just to geographic or political borders, but religious borders as well. In recent years, scholars have provocatively pointed to the complicated, rich, and vexed space that borders occupy. The so-called migrant crisis of today's U.S.-Mexico border reminds us of the contemporary urgency of rethinking borders as spaces of both danger and opportunity. From the perspective of migrants and refugees themselves, crossing borders does not always require leaving everything behind. The experiences of the crypto-Jews of Spain and Portugal who escaped to Mexico, New Mexico, Cape Verde, and elsewhere tell us that the suitcases they packed contained as much invisible as visible baggage. The ways that they and their descendants lived out their complicated religious identities suggest that an all-or-nothing model of religion can obscure complicated levels of engagement. And today, the modern descendants of those refugees remind us so. My research forms part of a new scholarly trend recognizing a buried history of Jewish activities across the African continent. Given that the typical map of religions in Africa exclude the mention of Jews, simply putting Jews on the map of Africa, both metaphorically and literally, can open up new conversations. Similarly, given that the typical map of the Jewish diaspora excludes sub-Saharan Africa, simply putting sub-Saharan Africa on those maps, again, literally as well as metaphorically, can open up other conversations. Adding New Mexico to the mix is an enticing bonus. So far, I've suggested parallels between the histories and experiences of New Mexico's crypto-Jews, about whom I'm guessing many of you already know something or a lot, and Cape Verdeans who have experienced similar histories. In the title to my talk, I alluded to this relationship as potentially one of long-lost cousins, not twins, because the parallels, while striking, are only partial, hence the question mark in my title. The particularities of history also inevitably introduce distinctive trajectories and experiences to these two groups' existences. The Cape Verde Islands represent a unique space in which to explore religious border crossings. Uninhabited at the time of Portuguese discovery, as I mentioned, the islands soon became populated by a blend of people from Catholic, Jewish, and also indigenous African religious traditions, thus arguably creating the world's first creolized population. For this reason, the British historian Tobias Green suggests that Cape Verde may be the place where we became modern. Likewise, for this reason, the overbearing weight of racial identity introduces critical differences into the experiences of the Cape Verdeans I've talked about today when compared to New Mexico's crypto-Jews. Still, the fact of enforced forgetting of a spiritual foundation, followed centuries later by a slow and sometimes shocking reawakening of submerged memories, must carry some shared existential weight. Cape Verde's premier living writer, Germano Almeida, once told me, well, all the Jews in Cabo Verde have died. But many, many Jews came to the islands and married Cape Verdeans and had children Cape Verdeans. So although they've all died, they mixed with us and they're part of us. I wonder if that might resonate for some in this audience. As for the Cape Verdeans I know, I can't say that New Mexico is front and center on their minds. But what I can say, and there is one living in New Mexico who I know, maybe we have some in the audience today. But what I can say is that for a variety of reasons that I haven't had time to discuss today, but we could always talk about this in the Q&A section, Cape Verdeans are becoming increasingly curious to discover their roots, Jewish, African, and otherwise. And they're using all sorts of means to do so, including finding their way to genetic testing. A private Facebook group dedicated to Cape Verdean genetic testing, Cape Verde DNA Inc., now boasts over 7,500 members, and people post just about daily with questions and comments about test results. In creating the group, the founder, a Cape Verdean American speech therapist, had two goals: to promote scientific knowledge about the technicalities of genetic testing and to help Cape Verdeans find what she called DNA relatives. From what I can tell, it's the social component of the site's online forum that draws followers and keeps the site active. When claims of Jewish origins show up in the test results, the online conversations become especially lively, with some posts eliciting hundreds of comments. Those comments sometimes include detailed advice about the intricacies of genetic tests and how to interpret the results, but typically they conclude with thanks, such as one that I'll quote now. To all my cousins who've responded, would like to get to know you better. I don't know most of those who've responded, but please know I love you. I can't help but love my family. The notion of a DNA cousin is strong with this group. It's also intriguing for an anthropologist. Technically, the word cousin denotes relatives who are connected by a pair of siblings a generation before them for first cousins, or 2 generations earlier for second cousins, and so forth. Cape Verdeans define the word cousin much more loosely. I've seen that reclassification in action on numerous occasions, including at that cemetery rededication I mentioned, where Cape Verdeans from around the globe embraced people, literally, they'd never met, and with whom they may or may not have had any knowable genealogical connection, as cousins, or prima, the Portuguese word for cousin that the Cape Verdean Criollo language adopted. I saw an even more striking instantiation of that designation in 2018 when the leadership of the Facebook DNA group I mentioned decided to host an in-person conference in Boston. Again, the organizers had 2 goals in mind: to share technical knowledge about how to pursue genetic testing and interpret the results, and to provide a physical space, in this case, where some of those virtual DNA cousins who had encountered each other on Facebook could meet in person. Maybe more than many nations, Cape Verde has seen its share of misery, and in various epochs, its history has been mired in both racism and anti-Semitism. Astonishingly, despite complicated histories of suffering, contemporary Cape Verdeans often lead lives of gracious endurance and, in many cases, triumph. The foundations of their open-mindedness and resilience, I believe, lie in the hybrid origins of the people themselves. I haven't had time to go into the details of those hybrid origins today, but as I've hinted, from the earliest times of the island settlement in the 15th century, they've attracted people from, 16th century, they've attracted people from around the world. The diversity of phenotype that Cape Verdeans today present indexes an unusually diverse mix of cultural and genetic backgrounds. Today, when I ask Cape Verdeans about their family's origins, more often than not, I receive cryptic smiles followed by wry answers such as, "I'm a mutt," or, more grandly, "I have the whole United Nations inside me." When it comes to discovering unexpected Jewish ancestry in DNA tests, then, responses typically range from surprise to delight, sometimes followed by efforts to research those roots. That openness to embracing diversity seems grounded in a historically deep place of hybrid origins. Adopting strangers as DNA cousins is perhaps a way to take an appealing metaphor of connection and legitimize it with the cloak of science. At that Boston conference, one of the organizers had clearly planned to make good on the promise of finding kinship everywhere at the conference. Her T-shirt plainly announced that attitude. Everybody's prima. When I asked if I might take her photo to document the sentiment, she grinned with delight. as she greeted and hugged every attendee she could, known and unknown. She seemed to capture everyone's mood in declaring that she must somehow be a cousin of everyone present. Thinking of her T-shirt and the quest for finding identity wherever it can be found leads me to imagine that Cape Verdeans with Jewish heritage might well embrace New Mexico's crypto-Jews as long-lost cousins. But the truth is, much concerning crypto-Jews' histories still today remains unknown. Even names are far from clear markers. What appears as an obvious marker of Jewish identity for some Cape Verdeans is invisible as such to others. Plenty of room for interpretation exists concerning which names are, quote, Jewish and which are not. These ambiguities add to an anthropologist's fascination with the subject. They also make for lively conversations among Cape Verdeans themselves. In that sense, names represent the ultimate hermeneutic question for increasing numbers of Cape Verdeans for whom they persist as interpretive challenges that are too often maddeningly unsolvable. So I leave you with a question with which I titled my talk. After all you've heard today, would you judge New Mexico's crypto-Jews and the Cape Verdeans I've told you about as long-lost cousins? So now I'd love to hear your questions, thoughts, and perhaps if you'd like to share your own experiences. Thank you.
So again, we can alternate questions from online. If we have any, Matt, give a signal, and then anyone here. Yeah?
I'm curious, are there oral traditions about the Jewishness that survive? Any orality?
Do people talk about these traditions? The
right.
people who do are the descendants of the Moroccan Jews. So as I mentioned, there were two basic waves, and I didn't go into this for today's talk. I mostly focused on the first wave, which is this very earliest wave, which came at the height of the Inquisition and as a response to the Inquisition. Starting in the mid-19th century, a whole second wave of Moroccan Jews started arriving over the course of about 60 years, from the 1840s into the early years of the 20th century. And they were fleeing various issues in Morocco. Some of them first went to Gibraltar, and then from there, because of trade and diplomatic arrangements between Portugal and Britain, they could legally travel from Gibraltar to Cape Verde. So that's a totally different group. It's likely that they knew that there were already histories of these earlier Jews from the Inquisition in Cape Verde, and that likely drew them, but they were a different group. And because they're much more recent, and because by the time they arrived in Cape Verde, the Inquisition had been disbanded in 1821, and they started coming in the 1840s. So they could legally practice Judaism. And some of them did continue practicing some Jewish practices. Today, there are no practicing Jews on the islands, although some folks, as I mentioned, are starting to revive it. And next month, for the first time, a public Passover will be celebrated in the President's Palace in Cape Verde. If I weren't in Santa Fe next month, I'd be in Cape Verde. So their descendants definitely talk about Jewish practices because they're just a few generations removed, and some of them have grandparents who had grandparents who migrated. But the descendants of these migrants from 300, 400, 500 years ago, it's just too long. So those oral histories have been submerged, but the practices remain. You know, we find people lighting candles on Fridays, having no idea why they would do it. Sometimes separating meat and dairy for no reason. Having two sets of plates and they don't know why, even though they're not necessarily used for meat or dairy, but they know they have to have two sets of plates for some reason. Not eating pork. Lots and lots of practices which they don't specifically associate. We can call this more of a somatic history than an oral history because they're not talking about it as such, but it's embodied. I don't know if that answers the question. Thank you for that. Yeah, they were not trashed the way anti-Semitic acts sometimes that we're familiar with even in the US today, trash Jewish cemeteries. They just got degraded. They weren't kept up. And so the tombstones started sinking into the ground, as you can see in one of these photos on the left and on the right. So they were these tombstones were meant to be raised. These are Moroccan-style tombstones. Ron probably knows them well from Morocco. The limestone that they used was probably imported from Morocco. And as you could see in the before picture on the left, they're literally sinking into the ground. So it's not that they were destroyed, it was just degraded. They weren't kept up. And so this nonprofit organization, which is based in Washington, D.C., raised funds. The majority of the funds, interestingly enough, were from the King of Morocco, who is a great supporter of Moroccan Jewry. They were able to not only restore the cemetery, so this is, you can see lots and lots of tombstones in the back. This is a tiny Jewish Moroccan section in a much, much, much larger Catholic cemetery that has thousands of tombs. So they delimited it. They added a little chain-linked area around it. There's signage indicating the names of everybody who was buried there. There are 10 burials and so forth. As I mentioned, 3 other cemeteries on 2 other islands have now been restored like this. It's likely that every island has some more of these cemeteries that are so degraded that they haven't even been discovered. So if anybody's looking for charitable contributions for next year's tax donations, the organization, I'm not connected with it, so I'm not getting a kickback, but the organization that produces these renovations and rededications is always looking for funding.
Hi, is there any evidence of use of the Ladino language, especially among that earliest wave, or would that have been suppressed along with Jewish practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish there were more linguists who asked that question. Whenever I ask my linguist friends who know about Ladino, they kind of shrug. And my Portuguese linguist friends, who are the best equipped to answer that question, claim that Portuguese Jews did not speak Ladino. That it's really a Spanish language. But they always kind of put a little bit of a question mark and say we're really not sure. But Portuguese and Spanish Jews, as I said, there were a lot of links, but also a lot of distinctions. And Portuguese Jews, like Portuguese in general, like to see themselves apart from Spain. So it's even possible that they didn't pick up Ladino as a way to distinguish themselves. That's just a wild hypothesis.
I have a question. You want to find contributions to your program for the Moroccan Jews. Always start in Montreal. That's where the ones are that left Morocco. They went to Montreal and were quite successful there. My question has to do with the city of Fez.
I'm not sure the mic is working there. I can hear, but maybe in the back people can't.
Thank you. My question has to do with the city of Fez in Morocco. I worked in Morocco several times, and I was told, and I never could verify it, that the diaspora that went to Fez, there's several families, maybe 2 or 3 out of all of them, that still have the key to their homes in Spain. Is that true?
Ron might know more about that. I'm going to cede the question to you in a minute.
Okay.
But what I want to say is I'm in the middle of reading a fantastic novel by Elizabeth Graver called Cantica, which I highly recommend. And 2 chapters ago, from what I'm reading now, that topic was mentioned.
Okay.
And it was dismissed as folklore and laughed at. But I have no idea if it's true.
Okay.
But the author of this, it's kind of a fictionalized memoir of her family's experience. So the characters in this book, which are loosely based on her family, claim that this is absolute nonsense. It's just one of these oral folklore things. But maybe Ron knows more.
Who knows? Yeah.
Have you ever heard anything more about it? Or?
No one today seems to have keys.
Yeah.
What's the population currently now of the islands?
The islands have about 500,000 on
Wow.
the islands, and loose estimates, sorry, I should have said that. Loose estimates are there may be as many as twice as many again, in other words, another 1 million off the islands as immigrants. So this is a migrating nation, and the diaspora, as I mentioned, is global.
And did you have the opportunity to take any courses with Joseph Campbell when you were at Sarah Lawrence?
I just missed him. He retired, I think, a year before I left, 2 years before. My husband, who also went to Sarah Lawrence, has a best friend who I think took his last course, maybe a year or two before I did. But his legacy was large. Yes. And I would say he's one of the early writers for me as a young high school student who attracted me to anthropology. Yeah. Did you have a special tie to him?
Just a connection long term, but no, I thought once you get into this field, you must have had some experience studying some of his work.
Of course, yeah, early on. Yeah, he was a good influence.
Thanks. Have there been any conjectures as to like what percentage of early Cape Verdean settlers were new Christians? And then I had one other question, as you've interviewed people, is everybody just sort of amazed and fascinated at the possibility of their Jewishness, or since being Jewish can be kind of complicated, or some people kind of ticked off or angry?
Yeah, both great questions. The first, I relied, since I'm not a historian, and this was a historically oriented talk because history is just all over the place. I much prefer to talk to living people than read through dusty, impenetrable archives. So I leave that work to my historians who love that work, and I have great respect for them. And the British historian whose work I really rely on is this guy I quoted twice, Tobias Green. He has a very long 600-page dissertation, absolutely comprehensive and brilliant, about the first 150 years of occupation. And he has done exhaustive archival research in, 5 languages and 8 countries or something. And he is absolutely convinced that the vast majority of early Portuguese settlers were new Christians. And he goes meticulously through individual biographies, which he thinks are quite definitive. Not 100%. I'm not sure he gives any actual statistics, but he does say a majority. So somewhere over 50%, which is extraordinary if we think about it, right? That's not what most of Africa looks like, that we know. Second question, what do people think about when they learn that they have Jewish ancestry? I sort of hinted at that, I didn't get into it in detail. I have yet, it could be an artifact of who I am and what I'm asking, so I don't discount that, but I have yet to hear firsthand or second or third hand about anybody who has an anti-Semitic reaction to learning that they have Jewish ancestry, which is not always the case. Genetic testing these days often produces a lot of disturbing racism on the part of white people who discover that they have black ancestry, for example, and reject it entirely. The Jefferson family saga is filled with that as a prominent public example. I have yet to see anything like that. Some Cape Verdeans who discover in their genetic tests that there seems to be evidence of Jewish ancestry, and there's all sorts of scientific complications with even these claims. Anyway, some of them, depending on the percentage, if it's a very low percent, 1, 2, 5, 10%, they might say, oh, that's interesting, and forget about it. If it's a higher percent, they may get pretty excited. For me, what's interesting is seeing people who have a very low percent who get excited. Sometimes people will say 2% and they get all excited and get really, really eager to research. Wow, I had no idea, 2%. I wonder what that means, right? And that's where this Facebook DNA group becomes really an amazing resource for them. And then a lot of them keep testing. I don't know if any of you have ever done genetic testing. It's a very imprecise science, and I'd almost call it a science in quotes. There's a lot of ambiguity and imprecision. And one of the reasons for the ambiguity and precision is there are many different companies that do the testing, and the results depend on pool. And because there's not just one pool, the pools are dispersed. And so the number of, for example, Jews who test with one company may be way higher than the number of Jews who test with another. So if there's a very low pool of Jewish clients in one company, it's less likely that Jewish ancestry will show up for anybody. There are a lot of complications. Many Cape Verdeans who start genetic testing get hooked. It almost becomes, I won't say a neurosis or an obsession, but it becomes a passion. And maybe every year or 2 or 3, they'll do another test to see if the results change. And the results usually change. And in many of their cases, their Jewish results increase as more Jews wind up testing. So they're looking. Some of them are really eager to say to the Facebook group, wow, I'm up to 20% this year, right? They're having a little competition. It's pretty interesting. Not everybody, but some. I haven't talked about much of the anti-Semitism in recent years. Obviously, it permeated the islands from the beginning because Judaism was outlawed and evil. But the Cape Verdeans who I know today who are living, when I ask them about anti-Semitism on the island, I get a very diverse range of reaction depending on which island they came from. There are 9 inhabited islands, and each island has its own character, its own history, its own demographic makeup. These islands are very different. They also have their own dialects. There are even micro regions on these tiny islands that are distinct genetically. There's a really interesting group of Cape Verdean and Portuguese geneticists who did a genetic study on one of the smallest islands and found micro regions, little neighborhoods, where the genetic pool looked very different from one neighborhood to another on these tiny islands. So their experiences are different. And when I asked them about possible anti-Semitism when they were growing up, depending on where they grew up, some of them told me that their priests preached anti-Semitism. Others said their priests never did, but in the schoolyard, their school friends did. And others said absolutely not. Jews were really welcomed and revered. So there's a lot of variety on the islands themselves.
Any other questions? No? Oh, okay, thank you. Well, again, please join me in thanking Dr. Gottlieb for coming.
And thanks so much for being here and listening and your awesome questions, which I really enjoyed.